out over the wall. And the horse, do you remember the name of the horse? Rex. And that was from the beginning, and on television. They didn't change anything there either. They issued 29 editions in comic book form of Sergeant Preston from 1951 to 1958. So, oops, sorry about that, Neil. And of course, there was some strips done, and of course there was the television series. Now the television series was done for 3 seasons, only of which 2 seasons were actually produced. The 3rd season was a compilation of all the original stuff. So if you want, let me give you a listen to the beginning of the original opening for the audio that I brought, and make sure to see if we can get this thing going here at all. Now this is for the original 15-minute opening.
The challenge of the Yukon. King, are you hosting? King, the swiftest, strongest of Eskimo lead dogs, blazes the trail through storm and snow for Sergeant Preston as he meets the challenge of the Yukon. Sergeant Preston was typical of the small band of Northwest Mounted Police who preserved law and order in the Yukon during the gold rush of '98. That was the year that brought over 50,000 men swarming into the Klondike region, and the greed for gold led to frequent violence and bloodshed. But in spite of the odds against them, the force preserved a splendid record in maintaining the right. The challenge of the North was answered, and justice ruled triumphant. It was early afternoon, and Sergeant Preston was on patrol duty in the Yukon with his lead dog, the Great King. The snow was swept clean from much of the land, and Preston had left his sled and team in town. What is it, King? All right, King, you lead the way. He's going after something, but I can't make out what it is. He's following a scent. It would be a good idea to see what it leads to.
Now, in the early 15-minute ones, there's an awful lot of dog barking. It does get a bit repetitious. And King, the wondrous dog of the North, must have really had a high IQ, because Sergeant Preston could tell him anything, and this dog would respond appropriately. Okay, in 1943, which was about 4 years before they actually got into the 30-minute version of Sergeant Preston, they did an audition show. They did a couple of them. One they did in 43 and another one they did in 44. We have both of them in the archive, and this is going to be a little bit longer than the take I gave you. I tried to get through the music in a moment or two of dialogue before I clipped it. But this is from December 27, 1943, and they were trying to figure out various ways that they could do a different opening other than what they were accustomed to doing on the other programs, or what you would normally hear as a static, standard opening on almost any radio show at all. And this is just one example of something that they were going to try to do that was a little bit different.
A ton of gold. These 4 words flashed over the nation's telegraph wires on July 17, 1897, and the Klondike Gold Rush was born. A little steamer from Alaska had nosed its way through Puget Sound and docked at Seattle. The captain's declaration of his cargo electrified the world. A ton of gold. Within a few weeks, countless thousands of men struck out for America's last and greatest frontier, the Klondike, through which flowed the mightiest river of the North, the Yukon. A year later, the big rush was in full force. It brought every manner of man and woman into the frozen wilderness to meet the multiple challenge of adventure, pioneering the unknown, and most important, gold. Law and order also came to the Yukon. There were many criminals and ordinary adventurers among the gold seekers, who were surprised to find that decency and justice had staunch guardians in the frozen North. The Royal Northwest Mounted Police, whose scarlet tunics and broad-brimmed hats symbolized law and order and protection for honest citizens, kept a watchful eye over the vast stretches of uncharted land. From these outstanding soldiers of government, we created a young sergeant named William Preston. Because of his bravery, resourcefulness, and courage, Sergeant Preston rapidly became one of the best-known and efficient policemen in the Yukon Territory. His friends were legion, and his only enemies were criminals. However, his greatest friend, companion, and helpmate was a dog. Not an ordinary dog in any sense of the word. This dog was a powerful animal, half husky and half shepherd, and possessed of almost human intelligence. He served as a free lead to the team of huskies that carried Sergeant Preston's sled over countless miles of frozen trails. The sergeant had raised him from a pup, and even then his proud head and lean, muscular body gave the impression of regal strength. And from this came his name, King. King, the wonder dog, who was ever faithful in helping his master, Sergeant Preston, bring law and order to the wilderness. Together they met. The challenge of the Yukon. I'm King of you Husky! King, the swiftest and strongest of Eskimo lead dogs, blazes the trail through storm and snow for Sergeant Preston as he meets the challenge of the Yukon. Sergeant Preston was typical of the small band of Northwest Mounted Police who preserved law and order in the Yukon during the gold rush of '98. That was the year that brought over 50,000 men swarming into the Klondike region, and the greed for gold led to frequent violence and bloodshed. But in spite of the odds against them, the force preserved a splendid record in maintaining the right. The challenge of the North was answered, and justice ruled triumphant.
A little heavy-handed on the drama, but you get the point, and they were still using the same opening little 5 or 6 seconds of music. They went on to do the first 30-minute show, and this is an example from June 12, 1947. It was the 485th broadcast of Preston, or Challenge of the Yukon to be more specific. And this was the opening of a show called The Wolf Club.
The challenge of the Yukon. It's King, swiftest and strongest lead dog of the North Country, blazing the trail for Sergeant Preston of the Northwest Mounted Police in his relentless pursuit of lawbreakers. Gold discovered in the Yukon, a stampede to the Klondike in the greedy race for riches. Now back to the days of the gold rush, when Sergeant Preston and his wonder dog King battled through storm and snow to preserve law and order as they met the challenge of the Yukon. Sergeant Preston, tall, young, and clear-eyed, was typical of the men who could be found in the Northwest Mounted Police Force of the Yukon country. He had taken advantage of a short holiday and was visiting a trapper friend of his, Dave Ferguson, who lived near Copper Creek. It was early spring, and Dave and the sergeant were doing some hunting along the Pelly River.
All right, so you can see there they didn't even use the music. The show eventually picked up a sponsor for Quaker Oats. And everybody remembers that when the show went to 30 minutes, it was Quaker Oats. Well, if that's the case, where is the Donna Diana Overture? The show initially started off as a 30-minute show with no sponsors. But on September 13th, 1948, The Fraud, this was the opening now that everybody remembers. This was the first broadcast for Quaker Oats, and this was the first use of the opening overture.
Now,
wind-swept, snow-covered reaches of the wild Northwest,